You're listening to WSTU Stewart.
This is WPSL Port St. Lucie.
The opinions on this program are those of the program host and guest and not necessarily those of WPSL. WPSL does not endorse products that may be mentioned. Any reproduction or retransmission of this broadcast is strictly prohibited without written consent of WPSL. Legal questions? Ask a lawyer. Give us a call at 340-1590, 340-1590 here at the studios of WPSL. And Ask a Lawyer with your host, attorney Stuart M. Address.
Good morning. I am Stuart Address, and this is Ask a Lawyer, May 20th, 2022, and we're well into year 5 of this show.
Hey, we are getting deluge with phone calls wondering when Stuart Address is coming back into the studio.
I enjoy being able to do it remotely.
Yeah, I'll bet you do. Yeah.
Well, we'll see. I've been thinking about that, particularly since I want to film. I want to do another spot.
Oh, yeah, you bet. Feel free. Yeah, you got some pictures right behind you. Some Mets pitcher, unknown guy.
There's a lot of Mets pictures right behind me.
Yeah.
And Rangers. Let's go Rangers.
Who?
Rangers.
Oh, that's a lacrosse team or something?
Game 2 tonight at 8. Not 7, tonight at 8.
Yeah.
That's my public message.
Yeah, it's been about 30 years since you could cheer for those guys.
It has been. I remember when I first moved to Florida in late 93, and the Rangers made the playoffs in 94. And I remember watching them win the Stanley Cup. Remember where I was. I had just moved to Florida, and they haven't done it since.
So how many times have you been to the Garden?
The Garden? I've been to the Garden actually probably at least half a dozen times, but never to see the Knicks or the Rangers. I was there to see Ringling Brothers. My parents used to take my sister and I to the Garden every year to see Ringling Brothers' Barnum and Bailey Circus. And I reinstituted that tradition here in Florida when they were coming to West Palm Beach. But of course, the circus is no more, at least not the way it used to be. I understand why. I disagree with some of the reasons. I wish the circus was here. But I did at least get to take my kid to the circus for a few years, just like my parents took my sister and I to the circus.
Yeah, we have
I know we had good times.
Yeah, we have a caller on line 1 from PETA who says that Stuart Address is in animal abuse. Oh,
yeah. Well, not quite, but
anyway, when you look at the way the Barnum and Bailey ran their operation, I mean, I don't know how anybody can possibly accuse them of that, but
they did it better than anybody else, and they were imperfect.
Yeah, well, hey.
But we're all imperfect in this world, and I guess that leads me into my prelude. I always have a topic ready. Usually we get to it. Sometimes we don't. I have something I want to discuss to start the show. It could be brief or it could be extensive, depending upon whether you folks want to call in. And I invite you to do so. 772-340-1590. I was watching CNN before today's show, and watching about today is the first funeral arising out of the Buffalo shooting. And it is the funeral of a 67-year-old deacon. And it's the first of many funerals, which I'm sure will all have their own personal storylines and people that have been left behind that are in grief and agony. And so I want to tell a story And I want to make an admission of my own. I mean, you all know that one of the areas that I really practice is in discrimination and civil rights. I've been doing this for almost 25 years. I've been practicing for about 37, but I've been doing this type of law since I moved to Florida. And so I would say now that, that's my life's work. And I've had some really fascinating cases and a lot of tragic cases, and many in which I've been able to help and some of which I've been unable to help. But, the ongoing violence in general and the ongoing violence against people of color, I need to just put this out there. Can anybody call me and explain to me why there's a need for racism? Because I honestly don't understand it. What is so significant about the color of somebody's skin, their religion, where they're from, their gender? I mean, honestly, I don't mean to be pompous, but what is the big deal? Now, since
as the rabbi always says, there's only one human race.
That's true. And if aliens ever do come to visit, they're going to be interested in the human race, not the white human race or any other human race. But since I don't know if I'm sounding pompous or not, but since I'm putting that out there, I want to tell a story and make my own admission in that regard. And it has to do with my attending Rutgers University in the early 80s. Now, let me set the stage. Rutgers has been around since before we were a nation, 1766. A matter of fact, Rutgers and Princeton played the very first football game, college football game. I forget whether it was Rutgers or Princeton, but one team won 3-0. That was the football score.
I can't remember if I called that one or not.
Yeah, right. And Rutgers, at the time I was there, had approximately 50,000 students in their New Brunswick area campus, which was really composed of 5 different colleges. And when I transferred into Rutgers my sophomore year, I was admitted to 2 different colleges. The prestigious college that was created in 1766, and a college across the river called Livingston, which was created in the early 1960s. And I later came to learn, why was Livingston created? It was created during the riots of the 1960s, and it was created as a way to appease African Americans, to make it easier for them to go to college. But of course, we don't want them here in New Brunswick at Rutgers. Let's create a college across the river in Piscataway and put them there. So put them on an island. And that is how Livingston was created. Now, it later sort of became amended, I guess to be politically correct, that it was created to enable minority students and first-generation college students to have a better opportunity to attend college. Well, that sounds wonderful. And I was and am a first-generation college student. So I chose to go to Livingston, not really because I knew the racial composition, but because Rutgers required a major, minor, and mini, and Livingston only required a major, giving me a lot more freedom in the classes that I could take. Well, my first year at Livingston, I learned one of the realities of Livingston. It was about 65% African American. Now, I took classes anywhere, Rutgers and another college called Cook and Douglas and different colleges within Rutgers. But I lived, I ate, and I took a number of classes on Livingston where I was the minority. And that was very clear. And I had lots of great debates, particularly in my sociology classes, where, Black students would argue with some obnoxious white students when a professor would bring into discussion, abandoned and discredited theories of why Blacks were inferior to whites, one being the supposed size of their brain. And in sociology, the professor, would teach us the theory. My God, they wouldn't be allowed to do that today. I mean, even critical race theory. They wouldn't be allowed to even tell us about that theory, much less tell us that theory was discredited and allow us to argue about it. But argue we did. And out of all of those arguments, I think, ended up becoming a discrimination and civil rights attorney. But it wasn't only that. Okay. One day, I decided to go to dinner. I've told this story many times within family, but certainly never on the air. One night, I decided to go to dinner in the Livingston cafeteria, and I walked in, and I was startled. I encountered a situation which I had never encountered in my life. For this particular moment in time, there wasn't a white face to be seen, just hundreds of Black faces. And I was very uncomfortable. I felt like I was out of place. I felt awkward and uncomfortable. I felt like every eye was on me. And instead of walking in and having dinner, I turned around and left. Sort of like crossing the street when, African Americans are approaching. I have to admit, I turned and left. That may be the single most embarrassing thing I now realize I've ever done in my life. And I realized it real quick.
Yeah, how old were you when this happened?
I was 19.
Okay.
But it didn't take me long to realize what I had done. I mean, I'm studying political science, I'm studying sociology, I'm living, among, friends that were African American. It didn't take me long to realize what I had done. Matter of fact, it took me about halfway between the walk from the cafeteria to the Roach Coach, where I always got a meatball sandwich. And I realized what I had done. And I was ashamed. And I was embarrassed. And I did nothing to correct it and go back. I continued to have classes with these people. I continued to debate these people. I continue to be friends with these people. And I've got to tell you, as a kid, I've gotten into my share of fights, physical fights. I have never had a Black man fight me or threaten me. It's always been other whites. It just never happened. Even at Livingston, nobody ever threatened me. Nobody ever made me feel uncomfortable. So I posed the question when I walked into that cafeteria, what was it that made me feel the way I did? And my answer, to myself at least, is that, you know, I somehow, maybe unintentionally by everybody, I don't know, but somehow I was conditioned to have at least a little bit of fear of African Americans. Maybe that was just the white way of life. Maybe it was because I lived in white neighborhoods. I don't know. But I do know that it was wrong. I do know that after that incident, personally, I tried to be conscious of whatever level of racism I may have deep down. And I tried to learn from it. And I certainly tried to never exhibit it again. And as a discrimination attorney and a civil rights attorney, I've taken great pride in representing everybody. And that includes, in large case, when you talk about discrimination of civil rights, African Americans. Indeed, there was one case where, this white Jewish attorney represented a German and an Arab. And all of us laughed about it because it was just unusual that the circumstance occurred that happened. But I've learned that we're all people. And again, I invite you to call 772-340-1590 with your stories or your explanations or your questions. I just don't understand. Why do we have to treat each other differently? What is it that compels at least a substantial minority of us to do so? I probably do sound a little pompous, a little preachy right now, but for a quarter of a century, this is the law I've practiced. I remember lots of my former clients. I remember those I was able to help and those I wasn't able to help. And I remember those I wish I could help. Matter of fact, here's a related story. I'm not going to give any names, of course. But I was contacted within the last few years to represent a Black widow whose husband was shot in front of her by the police. Not going to tell you where. And she came to me with lots of evidence that this was a bad shooting in their own home. And the cops, the two white cops, just acted way too precipitously. That it was a bad shoot and probably made a good civil rights case. And this widow was begging for help, begging for somebody to take her case and argue it. And obviously, before she got to me, many other attorneys had rejected it. And indeed, I spoke with several attorneys about possibly co-counseling the case, including a couple leading African-American attorneys, all of whom also turned it down. And as I began to understand why it was turned down, I was compelled to turn it down as well. And this widow has not and will not ever get any relief for the wrong that was done to her husband. Now, what exactly happened? her husband had some emotional difficulties, like I think we all do from time to time. And his got extreme at one point, and he Baker acted himself. Now, that's important. He did it to himself. Okay? He was aware enough to realize he needed help. Why did he need help? Because one day he realized that although in reality, honestly, he loved his wife, he certainly didn't want to kill her, but in his mind, he was thinking about killing her. He was thinking about getting a knife and stabbing her. And so instead of leaving the room he was in, which was far away from where his wife was in the kitchen, he called for help, and he Baker acted himself. And he got some additional help, and he came home when he was deemed ready to come home. And there came to be another situation where he felt that he was going to do something bad. He didn't want to do it, but he felt whatever he felt. And so he called 911, and the police responded. Now, they found him and his wife standing next to each other in the kitchen. They both had knives in their hands. They had been cutting vegetables and fruit. If you walked a little bit further into the house, you could see that on the kitchen counter. So, the widow says both of them, the knives weren't being held in an aggressive manner, but yes, they both had knives in their hands. The police barged in, did knock, have one of them come. They felt there were exigent circumstances. They heard somebody from inside yelling, "Help, help." Bunch of bull. That's the excuse given when you want to enter without a warrant. So they entered. They saw the man and woman standing next to each other with knives in their hands. They, of course, both yelled, "Drop the knives, drop the knives." Perfectly appropriate. The wife dropped her knife. The husband didn't. You know, his head was in La La Land somewhere, which is why he called 911. And they yelled at him a couple more times, "Drop the knife, drop the knife." And according to the widow, the next thing she knows, both officers fire and kill him where he stood. Now, that's not the cop's story. Not the cop story they gave to Internal Affairs, and I listened to the tapes. Not the cop story they gave to the state attorney's office, who was investigating them for possible manslaughter or murder charges. And so I listened to the widow's story, which was taped about 10, 15 minutes after the incident across the street at a neighbor's house. And I listened to the cop stories, two of them, which were taped about a week later at the state attorney's office, where they knew that they were being investigated. And I decided that the widow was far more credible. Why? Well, first of all, her statement was given within minutes. And, even under what are called hearsay rules in court, there is an exception for excited utterances. And excited utterances are those that are made with a short period of time after a traumatic incident, where it is believed that the person making the statement has not yet had time to formulate a plan or anything that would be mendacious, fancy word for a lie. And, she said that he stood where he was. The only thing he did wrong was he didn't drop the knife. And the next thing she knew, he was shot and he just fell forward where he was. Now, I'm not an expert in crime scenes, but the photos I saw and the blood splatter I saw seemed to indicate to me that he simply fell forward. That's consistent with what the widow says. And then I listened to the cops' statements, both to Internal Affairs and then to the state attorney's office. And I heard a similar story given by both officers. By the way, one was a rookie and the other was a training officer. The one was very inexperienced. And the stories were similar, but with just enough differences to cause me to believe with almost a shadow of a doubt that they were lying. For example, one officer said that the victim had the knife held in front of the wife with the knife in front of her throat. Now, okay, that would contradict the wife, who said it was straight down at his arm towards the floor. But then you have the other officer who said not that the knife was in front of her throat, but that he held the knife straight up raised. Well, that's two very different stories from the officers about how the knife was held. You have one officer which said that they shot because he began to approach them. Now, they're within 15 feet of him to begin with, so I would agree. If somebody with a knife is approaching you and you're yelling, drop the knife, or I'll shoot, and they don't drop the knife, I could certainly understand shooting. But the other officer didn't say that he began to approach, instead said that he ran towards them. Now, to cover 15 feet would take like a second and a half. So that would be pretty significant, and I could understand shooting. But again, it contradicted the other officer. So the knife, the way he did or did not approach them, and a few other things, led me to firmly believe the cops were lying and that this was a bad shoot.
So who fired the first shot? Was it the rookie officer or the TO?
Trying to remember that. I believe it was the rookie, and the TO shot within a second afterwards. And to me, I thought, and I thought that the key to this case and overcoming what's called qualified immunity, which I'll explain briefly in a moment, would be the autopsy report. And I wanted to know whether the autopsy report can explain the angle that the bullet entered the gentleman. Because if he was standing straight there, you would expect a straight-on horizontal bullet. If he was approaching them and his legs were moving and his body was bending over, you would expect the bullet to have entered on an angle. And I thought that should be readily apparent from an autopsy report. And I had two very competent criminal defense attorneys help me in obtaining it and in understanding the report, because I couldn't make head nor tails out of it. And they both told me that it appeared that the bullet came in straight on or on a slight angle, but that it wasn't conclusive enough, and the study, the focus had not been on that, so that the coroner really never came to give an opinion on that before the body had been cremated. And so I wasn't likely to have a firm answer on that from what we had. So then I had to decide, with all I now knew, do I take the case? And my wife will tell you, for months, I struggled. I desperately wanted to take this case because I wanted to right a wrong. And I also knew that I was very unlikely to win the case. And if I did, it would only be after 2 appeals to the 11th Circuit. Why 2? Qualified immunity. What is qualified immunity? The police have qualified immunity against being sued for all of their actions except those which clearly violate a constitutional provision. Now, you'd say, does shooting somebody clearly violate a constitutional provision? No. There's legitimate reasons for officers and ordinary people to fire guns which end up killing another person. So the real question is whether the victim here was deprived of life without due process of law. That's the question. And in most federal circuits, and definitely here in the 11th Circuit, the courts say that to be clear and unmistakable, so that a reasonable officer would know that his conduct would violate the law, there has to have been a prior decision of the 11th Circuit on that type of conduct. So unless it's been proven once, the officer is entitled to qualified immunity. To which my response is, how can it ever be proven once if you're not allowed to prove it until it's been proven? Now, I don't know how to answer that legal question. It still flabbergasts me. But that is essentially the law of qualified immunity. So, qualified immunity doesn't just protect an officer from losing a case. It protects an officer from being sued. So the first thing that happens in police cases is when you file a complaint and they respond with a motion to dismiss on the basis of qualified immunity. And let's say the federal district court grants that motion to dismiss. If you want to challenge it, you have to go up to the 11th Circuit on appeal. If the district court denies the motion to dismiss, the cops go up to the 11th Circuit on motion on an appeal. So let's say we all go to the 11th Circuit and the 11th Circuit says, no, the circumstances here, the facts here lead us to believe that there should be discovery and we should further flesh out the circumstances here. It's not so clear and unambiguous that we're going to stop the case right here. So now we go through all this discovery. And before trial, the officers make another motion. It's also on qualified immunity. But it's not a motion to dismiss, it's called a motion for summary judgment. The difference? Well, one was at the beginning of the case, and one was closer to trial when most discovery has been done. Why is that important? Because on the motion to dismiss at the beginning of the case, the court has to accept and it can only look at the four corners of the complaint. They can't look at anything outside the complaint. So it's a very tough standard to meet. And the officers are given every benefit of the doubt there, based upon the circumstances as described in the complaint. On a motion for summary judgment, the court is asking itself a question: is there a genuine dispute as to any material fact? Or has discovery basically created a situation where, while people disagree on the result of the interpretation, they essentially agree on all the facts? If so, the court can decide the case on summary judgment. Grant summary judgment and the plaintiffs win, and a jury only decides damages. Deny summary judgment, and the plaintiff goes to trial, has to prove the case, and then get damages. Or grant summary judgment, and the case is over, the police win. Now, let's say the court grants summary judgment and the police win. What do you think happens then if we want to fight? We've got to appeal to the 11th Circuit. So, one, it gets very, 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 very expensive. And as a solo practitioner, I have limited funds in which I can fund any case or cases at one given time. And I'm only going to get that money back if there's a settlement or we win. And knowing and researching just how difficult it is for a plaintiff to, in the end, overcome qualified immunity, I too had to pass on the case. It just, the risk was overwhelming. And indeed, bills have recently been introduced into Congress, especially following the George Floyd killing, to modify qualified immunity, to change it so that it is not such a shield to the police. Do they deserve some protection from crazy lawsuits? Absolutely. But from almost every meritorious lawsuit? No. So that's a situation where I would look back for the rest of my life. In that case, I will play back the facts in my mind and always regret the day that I had to explain to the widow that I too had to pass on the case. And the amazing thing was, she responded with grace, and understanding, and appreciation for the effort and the time looking into the matter. And, you know, that makes it harder on my end, actually. It's easier when somebody's angry with you. You can move on from that. But when they have every reason to be angry with you or at the situation, and they handle it with the grace in which you could only wish you could handle a situation if that ever occurred, it's harder to put aside. Again, I am inviting you to call 772-340-1590. I can't believe that this is a topic that people don't have opinions on.
Have you ever argued a case before the state Supreme Court or the Court of Appeals?
I have argued before two different state courts of appeal here in Florida. I have not argued before the Florida Supreme Court or the 11th Circuit. I was part of two cases that were in front of the 11th Circuit, one in which we had to pull an all-nighter to get a brief ready in time. I am a member of the bar of the Supreme Court of the United States, which basically allows me, if I'm ever in Washington while they're having arguments, I could sit in the attorney section so that I don't have to leave after 5 minutes, so that they keep ushering you out so other people can come in.
Have you ever done that? That would be cool.
I haven't been back to DC, amazingly. But yes, it would be cool. And I still hope one day to go there when I know there is argument, and to be able to sit there, because frankly, just to sit in the court. I mean, I've been inside the court because I was sworn, in as a member of the bar. And I met with, I was sworn in from New Jersey. I met with a justice who was then from Jersey. And in a conference room, we all met. And being that close to a justice of the Supreme Court was like being that close to a rock star. I mean, at least me, I was a practicing attorney then, obviously, but I looked at this man who wasn't wearing robes because he wasn't in the courtroom. He was in a suit and tie. But I looked at this man as like God. And now, as I discussed last week, I don't really think of Supreme Court justices that way anymore. They have let me down and let the country down, in my opinion, several times during my last 30 plus years practicing law, with decisions that I felt were either wrong or political or based upon being a Republican or a Democrat. Famously, when Donald Trump complained, I hate to agree with him in anything. When Donald Trump complained about Republican and Democrat judges, and Chief Justice Roberts felt compelled to respond. You have to understand this. Justices of the Supreme Court, they don't respond to things that are said about them by the executive branch or the legislative branch. They are above that. But in this situation, Chief Justice Roberts felt compelled to respond and put out a statement, and it was actually spoke it, so you heard him. But there are no Republican judges. There are no Democratic judges. There are just judges. And wow, I'd love to believe that. And I think he probably does believe that, because he's crossed, the line 5-4 this way, 5-4 that way, many times. And if every justice would hear every case and decide every case separately without any leaning one way or the other, that would be wonderful. We have Pat on line 1. Hello, Pat.
Hello. Just wondering what you think of the world that your son is going to be living in. And
Wow.
I'll listen off air if that's okay.
That's perfect.
Thank you.
For calling. Excellent question. Wow. The question is, what do I think of the world that my son is going to live in? I'm scared. I'm scared for him. I'm scared that he's going to live in a world of increasing hate, increasing division among peoples, that he's going to live in a world that predates when I was born, a world where a woman doesn't have a right to choose, a world where it's okay to discriminate against people that are different. And that's not just blacks or people from Mexico, those drug dealers and rapists. It's also people who are gay, people who are LGBTQ plus, and whatever else may come up in the future. That is a world that I find scary. And I can only hope. I heard this just recently again, the other day, but I can only hope that Barack Obama was correct when he said that progress is not made in a straight line. That we go forward and we fall back, we go forward a little more, fall back. Clearly, we have fallen way back in the last 4 years and are about to fall way further back, probably as soon as next month when the Supreme Court issues its opinion overturning Roe versus Wade.
Okay, I've got a question about the FBI.
The question about the FBI.
When you had the situation in South Florida, that kid was on the FBI watch list as being troubled. Now, all of a sudden, you got this whack job in Buffalo, and he too had been called into an FBI office when he was in high school. What is wrong with the FBI?
Honestly, I have to say, Greg's question is the situation in Buffalo, the situation in South Florida, where the shooters were on the FBI watch list. They were at some point called in to speak to the FBI, let go, and they then go on with their massacres. Question Greg poses is, what's wrong with the FBI? If you believe in our system of law, nothing. Those individuals had not committed any act which was provably illegal at that point. Unless this is George Orwell's 1984, there are no thought police, and you cannot be detained or arrested or imprisoned because you think something, you write something on some board on Facebook or elsewhere, you're part of a right wing, a left wing, whatever group, that could cause them to look at you more closely, but they can't do anything. Now, that doesn't mean that nothing can be done. It just means that nothing can really be done by them. Could, let's say, the parents seek to have the child, whatever state you're in, the equivalent of Baker acted? Could, if it's a school, could some teacher notice something and suggest that he be evaluated or she be evaluated? Yeah, there's a lot more proactive things which can be done. Now, in a situation in Buffalo where he just walks into a supermarket and starts shooting, I'm not sure, who could have suggested evaluation, but we're beginning to know he was on these message boards, and that he had a plan. And they always say, if somebody has a plan, that's when you need to worry. I've talked to a number of psychiatrists who say, when somebody says they've thought of suicide, that's not the worrisome thing, because to some extent, everybody has thought of suicide at some point. Not necessarily doing it, but thought of it. And even if you thought of doing it, if you haven't gone so far as to think of how you're going to do it and what the plan would be to do it, that's the scary thing. That's the marker to a psychiatrist, or supposedly to any therapist, that you need help. When the plan exists, thought of a plan. People that are at the edge of let's say if you go visit the Grand Canyon, and you're standing as near to the edge as you can get, and you look down, even somebody who likes to jump out of airplanes, you look down, for a moment, you're going to get a sense of vertigo. And you're going to think, what if I jumped? That doesn't mean you're going to jump. It means that the thought passes our mind. So, I have 2 minutes and to sort of sum up, and I'll be honest with you, I wish there had been more calls. This racism, all aspects of discrimination, it's too big of a topic. I mean, I've never said this to whatever my audience is, but why haven't you called? There have to be strong opinions here. It's too important of an issue to be quiet. I admitted my failing. I'm not asking you to admit yours. I'm asking you to have an opinion. Well, I got a few years left in me of practicing law, and who knows what the future will bring. But I do know that ever since that day when I was 19, so for 43 years, I've worked on trying not to be racist in my feelings or my actions towards anyone. This is Stuart Address for Ask a Lawyer. I hope you have a good week and a good weekend. And if you'd like to talk to my office about a possible case, please give us a call at 772-781-8003. Goodbye, and I will talk to you next week.
You've been listening to Ask a Lawyer right here on WPSL Port St. Lucie and WSTU Stewart.